Hello, I'm here at the very beautiful campus of the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. It's a beautiful day and I'm here having a really interesting Skype conversation with Ramon Spaaij. He is the global expert on lone wolf terrorism and he's going to talk to us today about what lone wolf is and what are the future trends that we'll see as internet becomes more and more and more ingrained in our daily lives. So hi, Ramon.
Hi, thank you for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. I see you have a bookstore, a bookcase behind you, so it's...
I do, very smart books.
It makes it more formal, even if it's far away.
Does, yes. Well, all the way from Melbourne in Australia. So it's nighttime here, so I'm ready to go.
Awesome. So talk to us. What is lone wolf terrorism? You must be tired of answering the question.
Totally. No, you're right. So it's a term that's often used and used in many different ways. So I think the first thing, sort of, particularly from an academic perspective, is okay. How do we actually define and conceptualize the phenomenon that we're studying, right? First and foremost, I think what it's about, it's basically where an act of terrorism is committed by an individual who is not a member of a terrorist group, and so who has a level of what we might say operational independence. So they're not directed by anyone else. In many ways, they choose their own targets. They can build their own sort of modus operandi. Yet in the process, and we'll get to talk about that later, they do often receive sort of inspiration and indirect influence from broader communities of belief or broader extremist movements around them. So they don't operate in a vacuum ideologically or in terms of the belief system, but they do operate independently in terms of not being directly linked to any organization. I think why that's interesting is because it requires sort of a shift in thinking, because historically we've tended to think about terrorism as an organized group-based process. That is historically how, when we ask, how do people come to this point where they believe, for example, they're detonating a bomb or triggering sort of a firearm on victims? How do they get to that point? This idea of radicalization. Historically, a lot of these things look at the social psychology of groups, for example, right? So group dynamics, charismatic leadership, how people are socialized into channeling their anger and hatred towards, so externalizing this towards a common enemy and things like that. So the question then is, okay, how does this work for an individual? Can we still understand an individual in the same way, or do we need different explanations, kind of, to do so? So that's kind of, I think, an important starting point.
How did this phenomenon evolved? How connected it is to contemporary internet-based technologies, or does it come from before we had them?
Yeah, so I think it has evolved a lot. So the first thing to say is it's not a new phenomenon, right? So we can trace it back at least to sort of late 19th century, where a section of the anarchist movement encouraged this propaganda by deed, and actually so individuals striking against high-profile politicians and etc., and doing so in an unorganized way, which was sort of consistent with anarchist thinking. But it has evolved a lot over time, where even more recently, sort of in the late 20th century, a lot of the iconic kind of lone wolves who have become some sort of cult figures, think about the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski, or Eric Rudolph, right? They used more traditional forms of media, for example, in their communication with their environment. So, for example, the Unabomber wrote that long manifesto, but also letters to newspapers and things like that, right? As opposed to what we're seeing now, how this phenomenon has become very closely linked with online activity, with virtual communities, so still a form of interaction, but it's interaction of a new kind, right?
Yes.
And so that's absolutely, it's really, in that sense, lone wolf terrorism, not new, but has evolved with the times, and it's really become heavily dependent influenced by new digital technologies.
How different the various kinds of lone wolf terrorism is. For instance, someone who is fighting in the name of the Islamic State, or someone who is part of the Animal Liberation Front?
Totally, it's very diverse. I think that's actually a really important point, because if you purely follow, as an outsider, the media discourse and political discourse, you would think, right, that basically all that's happening is of the kind of jihadist nature. So it's either Al-Qaeda linked or it's Islamic State linked. It's actually not the case, right? If you open up, if you purely look, so the study I did with my colleague, Professor Mark Ham at Indiana State University, we looked at all the cases of lone wolf terrorism in America over the past, 75 years, right? And so, particularly in recent years, so if you look only since 9/11, so the last 15 years, you see that it's pretty much split 50-50 in terms of 50% of the attacks are linked in some way to sort of jihadist ideologies, so be it Al-Qaeda inspired or Islamic State inspired. But the other 50% is much more right-wing extremism, white supremacy, or even Christian fundamentalists, right? And so, in other words, the risk here again is that we have this tunnel vision where we become extremely focused on one strand, right, of lone wolf terrorism, whereas actually there's a broader spectrum here. And what we see in political discourse and media discourse is that we tend to label and treat, right, and fight these different strands differently, right? We differentiate. So in the case of sort of jihadist-related attacks, we clearly label them generally as terrorist attacks, whereas right-wing extremist attacks we tend to generally label as hate crimes. Now, that's more than just semantics, right? Those are kind of, if you think about it in terms of cultures, they're performative speech acts. So they change the parameters of what is a justifiable response, right? Yeah. In saying that in a terrorist attack, the parameters become much broader of what is, which might include a military sort of operation, right? So it's a very different response, and I think one of the big risks there is that you start creating, and this is well known in the literature, that you can start creating suspect communities. How people simply by mere association with a particular religion, right, and their own identity, become suspect and at risk or vulnerable, and how does that, how can that be counterproductive in further actually fueling the marginalization and alienation of certain, particularly young men, but say Muslim communities in general, which we know are actually drivers of radicalization. So you might end up with a kind of a vicious cycle, and I think that's one of the key challenges as well that we face here, where we as human beings like to label, categorize, generalize, yes. But it's not only problematic and unhelpful, can actually be counterproductive and actually stoke the flames of this radicalization that we're trying to reduce, right?
Yes. This is just an easy yes/no question. Well, but if you want to elaborate further, I would be enchanted. Do you think there are good and bad times of lone wolf terrorism, as in, are there causes that are worth ideologically ascribing to and supporting, even if one is not part of any terrorist organization or group?
That's a good question. The short answer for me, depends from whose perspectives. Do you mean from the perspective of the perpetrator, or from me as an observer, sort of?
As society.
I think, look, I would generally say the answer is no, because I generally believe that any form of violence that leads to the loss of lives or is intended to destroy lives, and often as many lives as possible, is unproductive. What I think is productive are more, let's say, constructive forms of civil disobedience, which play a very important role in society. And so, as a sort of a conflict sociologist, I believe that conflict has a very strong role in actually producing social change and societal and culture change. So it has a very important role in society. But I think the extreme end of terrorist violence that is aimed at ending lives is not particularly helpful. But I think what it does do, I think if you sort of think about impact, it does of course force us to also take a good hard look at ourselves as a society and think, what is it within ourselves, within our own communities, that produces these kind of atrocious acts, right?
Yes.
The problem is, I think, the opposite, is that we actually, in most cases, don't do that. Instead, what we tend to do, we place the act outside of our own society. So,
Yes.
in other words, this individual is mad,
Yes.
insane, mentally ill, or, just to paraphrase Donald Trump, this person is an Afghan. It's not one of us, it's someone else, right? So what that does is, again, it's a performative act. In sort of, the problem is them, not us,
Yes.
right? There's nothing within our own community about, for example, how we link the performance of masculinity, for example, to violence, right? Or how violence can become a coping mechanism, particularly for men, to demonstrate their worth in society. It's just one particular interpretation. But what I'm trying to say here is that there's a broader cultural script and cultural context that we tend to strip away, when in fact I think what it's needed is more introspection in actually how we as a society can do more to actually prevent these kind of attacks, right? In a way that actually forces us to take a good hard look at ourselves as well. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense,
Yes,
but yeah.
It does. It's a very interesting way of answering.